up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be discussing more high strangeness. As some of you may or may not know, it has been a very long week for me, and because of that, I didn't have my usual Monday morning upload for you all, and when that happens, I get highly agitated. As I scoured my research and saved documents, articles, and other source material, I came across some more high strangeness and figured what better way to say I'm sorry this is late than to bring you all more of what seems to be one of your favorite topics that I do on this channel. I'm pretty picky with what I'll allow to fall under the title of high strangeness on this channel, but I don't think you guys are going to be at all disappointed with this one. So, from extraterrestrial beings that have only ever been seen once to some other seriously strange things that simply, or at least seemingly, defy all logic and reason, let's jump right in. Now, when it comes to the word extraterrestrial, there are a few images that almost immediately will come to mind for the majority of the human race. I would say that's more than just my opinion too. More often than not, someone will either picture the aliens we have come to know as the Greys, or to a lesser extent the reptilians, and sometimes even perhaps like a Nordic looking alien will pop in there somewhere. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that mainly the image would be of the Greys, unless you have personally had an experience with a different race or type of extraterrestrial. So someone says extraterrestrial, boom, Greys pop into your head, right? The cover of Whitley Strieber's Communion. This happens with the Greys or whatever image you just thought of, because these are the ones we have been either encountering ourselves or seeing/hearing about other people encountering for at least decades. However, I have recently come across some other extraterrestrials who, for the most part, just roll through wherever they are, conduct their business, leave behind some confused and possibly terrified witnesses, and then disappear, seemingly at least, into the ether, never to be seen or encountered again. Let's start with the so-called Flatwood Monster of 1952. This is one of the best examples I could find of this type of thing happening, being that a terrifying extraterrestrial creature appeared in front of several witnesses, but only that one time, and it seems to have never been seen or encountered since. This legendary creature is sometimes called the Braxton County Monster, and it happened, obviously from the name, way back in 1952. One person who has investigated this particular extraterrestrial extensively is a man named Frank Fascino. He wrote a book in 2004 called The Braxton County Monster, the cover-up of the Braxton County Monster Revealed. In this book, he said, quote, "On the night of September 12, 1952, a shocked American public sought answers when strange, unidentified objects were seen flying through the sky over Washington, D.C. and the eastern United States. One of the strange objects crash-landed in a rural hilltop in Flatwoods, West Virginia," end quote. He went on to say that a group of schoolboys witnessed the actual descent of the craft/thing. They and two adults who were there as well, quote, "headed off to look for the object," end quote. According to many of the people who witnessed this, there was way more than one UFO there roving around through the air. Someone named Kevin Randall, whom the only title I could find for him was UFO Authority, said about it, quote, "What they saw was not an animal, but some sort of creature, at least in their perception. They could see no arms or legs, but did see a head that was shaped like an ace of spades." That was the description that would reoccur with all these witnesses. No one was sure if there were eyes on the creature or if there was a clear space on the head resembling a window, and that the eyes were somehow behind that window and behind the face, end quote. I want to break that down for a second. No one was sure if there were eyes on the creature or if there was a clear space on the head resembling a window. So did it have like never mind. Just gonna roll with it, guys. This thing was also described as being 12 foot tall and hideous looking. Obviously, the terrified group of witnesses ran for their lives in a complete and total state of what I'm sure was shock and terror, probably like they've never felt before. A little while later, though, a whole crew of people returned to the spot to see the monster. I'm not sure what their plan was or what they thought they were going to do about it or what, but they did return, and when they did, they found absolutely nothing. There was no beast from the sky anywhere to be found, and there also seemed to be no evidence at all that it had ever been there to begin with. In my opinion, things like this happen all the time. It's just that this time there were far too many witnesses for anyone trying to cover it up to be able to keep every single one of them silent. Or when talking about individual witnesses, they can somehow convince themselves or people they tell about the horrific experience can talk them out of what they think they saw. Power in numbers, right? Or as I like to say, the power of the group. In this case though, because like I said, there were so many witnesses, the legend lived on. The thing wasn't ever seen again to this very day, but the people who saw it refused to let the legend die and insist they know what they saw. They're not going to be silenced or talked out of it. Even all these years later, the people who are still around, who were there that day and saw the horrific extraterrestrial beastie thing, they remember it vividly as though it only were yesterday. It spanned generations, and still today, people in Flatwoods, West Virginia are talking about it, and some of them are even waiting for its return. What happened that night way back in September of 1952, and why has it never happened again? No one was abducted or harmed in any way, and I wonder if the creature accidentally landed when it did. It said crash landed, so were there the same creatures in the other flying crafts that were flying and zipping around through the skies that night? I'm sure, guys, I have no idea, but seriously, the description they gave of the entity was terrifying. I haven't come across that particular extraterrestrial in any other encounters, and I've been researching ET encounters for years now. So interesting, though, to say the least. Let's move across the pond from the United States and go to Scotland. On November 17th, 1968, an equally bizarre UFO experience happened in the woods of Scotland and involved some pretty credible witnesses, 2 members of the British Territorial Army, or TA. As part of a training exercise that everyone who joined the TA had to go through, a unit based from Aberdeen was dispatched to a particular area near Balmoral Castle in Scotland. They were taking part in practicing their special maneuvers, and it was a weekend. During one exercise, 2 men were told to go on ahead and guard a small hilltop and the surrounding area. They were in full gear and acting as though this weren't a practice drill, so the first thing they did was they went about digging a trench for cover. As they sat there keeping guard throughout the night, all was quiet at first. However, in the early morning hours, they both started to hear strange gurgling noises. They held still to try to decipher where the sounds were coming from and decided that it was coming from some trees a little over 100 yards away and to the side of them. Of course, they were curious, but also their whole purpose in being there was to keep guard of that area, and so they went to see what was going on with that particular group of trees. Once they got close, though, they noticed 2 gigantic figures with glowing green eyes and mouths that were described as, quote, fiery red mouths, end quote, coming right at them. Their terror heightened when they saw that each figure was more than 7 feet tall, and they noped the F out of there as fast as they could. They basically turned and ran. As they did this, ran for their lives I mean, they started to hear a bizarre squishing sound following quickly behind them and fast approaching. They turned to look and saw a gigantic disc-shaped UFO in the sky, which appeared now to be following them. This unidentified craft dove toward them, and that's when they saw it disappear almost right before it hit them and vanished in a trail of fiery sparks. The sparks rained down on them, but despite this whole experience, they decided they weren't going to tell anyone, not even their superior officers. They weren't talking about what they had experienced there at all. I think I may have covered this one once before, and I'll try to leave the other high strangeness encounters in the description box, and I am trying my best to catch up with iCards in the corners of the videos and tags, so just bear with me on that like you guys always do. Please and thank you. If you're interested though and don't find them immediately in the description box or an iCard in the corner of the video here, just look at all of my videos and find the high strangeness ones, because I'm pretty sure I just covered that encounter like on another high strangeness in depth. So what do you guys think so far? Do witnesses who have jobs like being in the military lend more credence to experiences in your opinion? What about when there's literally dozens of witnesses? I believe it all makes it so much more believable, but it wouldn't be the first time that I was called naive or gullible, right? As always, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Next up is a particularly interesting and bizarre alleged abduction that happened on October 10th, 1973. Once again, we have strange alien beings that have never been reported being encountered in any way, shape, or form since this one encounter, or for that matter, before it either. This is another one-time shot as far as encountering these particular entities. The victims were 2 men whose names were Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, and at the time of the ordeal, they were fishing on the banks of the Pascagoula River in Mississippi, United States. At approximately 9 p.m., the 2 men noticed a light in the distance. The men later described it as following the river and coming right at them. As it closed in on them, they noticed it was in the shape of an egg and very brightly lit. It was accompanied by a, quote, deep throbbing hum, end quote, which made both of the men sick to their stomachs. They were suddenly disoriented, but were able to see that a hatch had opened and 3 extremely strange beings were now approaching them. Not only was all of this strange and obviously concerning, the beings were said to have been floating toward them instead of walking or even flying. They floated along from the craft all the way across the river and toward the men. The men later described these unique extraterrestrials as humanoid, but with faces that looked like some sort of masks. 3 pointy things that looked like actual carrots were protruding and sticking out of the tops of their heads. They had lobster or crab-like claws instead of hands. The men were frozen with fear, but they were also seemingly put into a state of complete paralysis, and the way they described it, they were quote-unquote manhandled by the 3 entities as they stood there powerless to do anything or get away. The men were abducted, and the usual torturous experiments were conducted on them against their will, and when it was all over, they were unceremoniously flung back into the river. These particular types of extraterrestrials have never been reported as being encountered ever again. Oh my God. This is all really terrifying, guys, but super interesting as well. And I honestly don't even know what to think. Now, I'm not technically moving on from extremely bizarre and somewhat, at least as far as we humans are concerned, one-of-a-kind alien encounters, but I want to talk about one in particular now, one type. If you haven't ever been abducted, then maybe it's all beyond your understanding and comprehension, but some cases of people who have claimed to have had some sort of interaction with extraterrestrials or another have more bizarre stories than most of what we come across pretty regularly. I only say this because in this community, we're constantly coming across more and more people who are being abducted, and in my opinion, it's happening enough that most of the time we kind of know what to expect one way or another. So what I mean is, this is abductions, but abductions unlike anything we've ever heard of. We've gotten to the point where we somewhat know which entities are more likely going to be involved and what's going to be happening to the abductee/victim. It's all so very horrific, confusing, terrifying, and unimaginable, but every once in a while I just come across an experience that is so incredibly extra, if it's to be believed, that I need to tell you all about it and see what you all think. These next couple of few encounters all have the same weird dwarfish type aliens that I don't think, to the best of my memory, I've come across yet. No matter what type of extraterrestrials we are discussing, it's all pretty strange and kind of brand new, as victims and witnesses alike continue to come out of the shadows along with whistleblowers, and it's just terrifying and fascinating all at once, and we can never really know what in the world, what not of this world, pun intended, haha, we are going to come across or start to experience next. There's no way of knowing or being able to tell, because every time we think we have like abductions down pat, okay, it's the Greys, they do genetic experiments, they implant things. Next we have the reptilians, that's when they come along, the reptilians, and they're sexually assaulting people in their beds. And now these dwarfish toughs, and you'll see what I mean. It's just like every time we think we have it figured out, they throw us something else. The purpose of all of the abductions varies by what specific species wants with us, and it's also very mysterious, like I said. Let's take a look here at some of the weirder encounters with entities that have been seen a few times, but not really enough for us to consider ourselves familiar with them as, say, the Greys or reptilians. These creatures I'm about to present to you, I wonder if maybe they're from another dimension instead of another planet, but then again, I wonder the same thing about all ETs. Okay, without further ado or rambling, here it is. So, the first encounter I found with these particular entities happened with several encounters with them over the course of a few days. It happened in 1954 in Venezuela. On April 10th, a hunter named Emilio Martinez was out hunting in the hills near Caracas. He was finishing for the day and walking the trails, making his way back to his vehicle, when what happened. As he walked, he heard a very low growling noise accompanied by a crashing sound coming from some nearby brush. He didn't want to investigate because he was immediately scared. He started walking as fast as he could so he could just get to his car and get the heck out of there. Once he was almost to safety, he turned to look back and saw 2 creatures that were, quite literally perhaps, out of this world. Guys, this is why you should never look back if you know something is following you. He described the 2 beings as short but squat, and he also said that they were, quote, half man, half monkey, end quote. They were covered in thick, coarse-looking matted hair or fur of some type. He had finally reached his car, but before he could open the doors, one of the creatures attacked him, leaping toward him, picking him up, and literally flinging him like he was weightless back down onto the ground. Once he was on the ground, he described the creature as being ferocious, as it bit and scratched him all over his body, his entire body. Emilio couldn't get away except to grab a large rock and bash this thing on its head to escape back into his car. He said it was a beast and that it had, according to Mysterious Universe, quote, a vice-like grip, end quote. He bashed it in the head and got into his car, but the encounter didn't end there because then both creatures were screaming and banging on his car. I imagine how he described this in my head, like when you watch those shows about animals attacking and monkeys or some other animal jump on top of some terrified family of four's vehicle and scare the poop out of them. He sped away though and managed to fling them off of his car. Now, if you take this one encounter at face value, it might seem like this was something cryptozoological, except that encounters like this kept on happening, and Emilio wasn't the only victim of what most people believe were the same two creatures, but what could very well have been several of them causing all of this mayhem and madness during this particular course of time. We just don't know. Our next encounter happened that same year in November, so 7 months later, to a truck driver named Gustavo Gonzalez. And I kind of remember that name, so we also may have covered this one before, but trust me, going forward, there are no more that we've already discussed. Gustavo was out with his friend and partner, Jose Ponce, and they were driving along in their truck to make a delivery or whatever, when all of a sudden they couldn't go any further because there was a metallic-shaped disc just hovering, quite ominously according to them, in the middle of the road and completely blocking their path. It was described as very large, metallic, and sphere-shaped. So just a little aside, guys, this is back when people were calling UFOs, specifically of the extraterrestrial kinds, flying saucers, and this type of description being described constantly is the exact reason why. I often wonder if maybe extraterrestrials have since evolved, because the more I research, the more I see that back in the 50s and 60s, this was the type of craft that was described and encountered over and over and over again. So anyway, Jose and Gustavo are terrified and have no idea what's going on, but they can't go forward and they're forced to stop. Gustavo very bravely got out of the truck and tentatively approached the craft to see what in the heck was going on. As he walked towards the craft, though, this weird creature kind of came out of nowhere and attacked him before he even knew what hit him. He described the creature as 3 feet tall and dwarf-like. It was allegedly wearing a loincloth and had, quote, blazing red eyes, end quote. This being/creature gave him one little shove, and it sent him flying back with such force it was almost like he had been picked up and thrown by someone 3 times his own size. Now, Gustavo is a full-sized man, and this creature was smaller than my 4-year-old. I get so caught up and fascinated in stories like this because I have never had a negative experience with an extraterrestrial that I can remember anyways, besides one encounter during a lucid dream with some reptilians. So for me to see something like this be so aggressive for seemingly no reason, I wonder what in the world these things were doing here in the first place, wherever they came from, because they obviously have immense strength to abduct us if they wanted to. So obviously, at least in this case, they didn't want to. Is it just the fact that we're regular size, at least, you know, to us, we're a normal human size, and does that pose a threat to them? Do they automatically see us as a threat and feel the need to attack immediately? Are they taught by someone or something to fear humans? If you really think about it, that would make perfect sense, wouldn't it? It's depending on what you personally believe, but I would say I more often than not come across encounters on the internet of people telling me about their own personal experiences. It seems like the extraterrestrials we normally encounter, they are worried about us destroying the planet and things like that because of how we war, etc. So, a little tangent, but I think it all needs to be brought up. Why were and are these things so damn aggressive? So, back to Gustavo and Jose. Once Gustavo hit the ground, he was immediately in fight mode and pulled a knife on this thing. By this time, the creature was right on top of him and he tried to stab it, but found his knife wouldn't even penetrate the thing's skin. He described the skin as something similar to steel. Suddenly, as he grappled with this thing he has now tried to stab, but whom he couldn't really defend himself against even with a weapon, the sphere opened up and 2 more of the exact same creatures jumped out and right on top of him to help the other one. As these 3 beings attacked Gustavo, another one that was still inside the craft shot some sort of ray gun onto him, which made him temporarily completely blind. When he finally could see again, he caught a glimpse of the creatures that had attacked him retreating back into the disc-shaped craft, and the hatch closed and it took off into the air. Gustavo immediately got back into the truck, and he and Jose, who I should mention did absolutely nothing to help his friend, and as far as what I could find in my research, sat idly by in the truck watching in horror as his friend got jumped by 3 hairy dwarf-sized aliens wearing loincloths. Not cool, Jose, not cool at all. Anyways, they wasted no time in making a hasty retreat and sped off as far as they could get and as fast as they could get there, away from where this all happened. The disc seemed to take flight and disappear into the ether in a matter of milliseconds. It was blink and you'll miss it fast. It was only 2 weeks later that 2 more hunters had an encounter with similar beings. The men's names were Lorenzo Flores and Jesus Gomez, and they were doing what they often did in hunting around the countryside near Carora. Suddenly, and seemingly out of nowhere again, a strange object appeared in front of them, out of nowhere. They described it as, quote, looking like 2 wash bowls put together, end quote, and alleged that it was, quote, spewing flames, end quote, out of the bottom of it. The craft seemed to stop and lower to the ground when it saw them, and once it landed, a side door opened and 4 tiny figures stepped out. They were described in some sources as being about 2 feet tall in this case, and in others it said that the men described them as approximately 3 feet tall. So let's split the difference and say that they were between 2 and 3 feet tall. Lorenzo Flores said of the encounter, quote, we saw 4 little men coming out of it. When they realized we were there, 4 of them grabbed Jesus and tried to drag him towards this thing. I could do nothing but take out my shotgun, which was unloaded, and strike one of them. The gun seemed to have struck rock or something harder, for it broke into 2 pieces. We could see no details as it was dark, but what we did notice was the abundant hair on their bodies and their great strength, end quote. I don't know exactly how, but I guess they each had a gun, and so maybe Jesus's was loaded, because the only way they could stand a chance of escaping was to fire at the creatures, and that's exactly what they did. The weapon and bullets had absolutely no effect on the beings except to make them beat a hasty retreat back to their craft. They got back inside and flew away with another burst of flames shooting from the bottom of their ship, while the terrified men ran as fast as they could back to their vehicle and drove as far away as they could get as well. They were covered with huge bruises and painful scratches from the fight and felt as though they didn't even damage or hurt the aliens at all. The things, right? We don't even know if they're aliens at this point. They were impervious to bullets, or so it seemed, so I wonder if they could feel fear and perhaps were afraid of guns. This leads me back to what I said before about extraterrestrials as a whole being scared and or fearful of human beings in general. Only 3 days later, it seems these things were at it again, and I still can't figure out their end game here. A man named Jesus Paz pulled his vehicle over to the side of the road in order to relieve himself when he was attacked and accosted by a tiny little 3-foot being that was covered in hair and seemed to have come out of nowhere. The thing came out of the bushes and eventually it retreated back to its ship and Paz made it back to his car. While the details are non-existent on this one, it's alleged that he had to be hospitalized and was, quote, seriously injured, end quote, from the attack. The craft looked like a silver disc as it flew off at impossible speeds into the sky. On December 19th of that same year, a man named Jose Parra was out for a jog when he came across an unbelievable sight. I picture this in my head, guys, and I can't even imagine what an ordinary person would be thinking and going through emotionally and mentally when they see something like this. I almost feel bad for these people, seriously. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw, quote, a group of hairy, ape-like dwarves, end quote, loading huge boulders into a somewhat small, brightly glowing, disc-shaped object that was hovering directly in front of them. Guys, the boulders, I am not even going to touch this one right now, but I will say the missing phenomenon in boulder fields. I'm just saying. So anyways, Jose was unfortunately just standing there stunned and watching this whole thing when one of the beings saw him. They immediately shot him with some sort of light beam which paralyzed him. It seems they paralyzed him only so they could take off and get away, and he wasn't otherwise attacked in any way. The craft shot off into the sky, and once it was out of sight, he regained the use of his body again and ran the hell out of there as fast as he could. This seems to be an ongoing theme for obvious reasons, right? Fortunately for him, I mean, I'm sure it was a harrowing and terrifying ordeal, but at the very least, he didn't get the crap kicked out of him like everyone else. These beings are thugs and seem to enjoy jumping people and traveling in like this gang or something. Let's keep going though, because the random group of alien toughs weren't done. As far as I can tell, all was quiet until 15 years later in December of 1967, November 2nd to be exact, there were 2 men named Guy Tosi and Will B. Gay. Yes, his name is Will B. Gay. That's his name. This happened in the United States, and these two men were driving along the highway and minding their own business near Riri, Idaho, when they also encountered these tough aliens, or alien tubs. They were suddenly blinded by a bright light and forced to stop driving because they couldn't see and didn't understand what was happening. After a minute or two, they were able to see what they described as, quote, a small dome-shaped UFO that was 8 feet long across the road, just hovering there about 5 feet off the ground. There was a creepy, glowing green light emanating from the bottom of the craft and kind of bathing the road, the way forward for the men in it, end quote. The craft itself was clear and the two men could see clearly inside of it. They saw two tiny little creatures sitting inside of it. The men obviously stopped their car, not knowing what else to do, as they really had nowhere else they could go. Once they stopped the car though, and as they sat there, the bottom of the craft opened up and one of these creatures literally floated out and directly toward them. Once again, the creature was described as approximately 3 feet tall, but this description from these witnesses was a little different. They said it had an oval head that was completely bald, huge ears, two teeny tiny deep set eyes with nothing but a slit for a mouth. The head was described by the men as, quote, heavily pitted and creased, end quote. The men were horrified and scared, and the creature itself just emanated creepiness. They were more than a little worried, I'm sure, and this is where it gets absolutely insane, guys. The creature opened the driver's side door and pushed the driver to the side. It was now sitting behind the steering wheel as though it were ready to start driving off at any second. That's not what happened though, because the craft was now pulling the car along with it by way of some sort of light beam or something like that. The information's all over the place on this one point. However, it was happening. The car was now moving, the thing at the wheel, and the two men who were basically just carjacked by this unidentified creature from the sky. The car, along with the being and the men, were all dragged out into the middle of a field on the side of the road. The car finally stopped moving, and the craft was now hovering directly above it. Guy Twossi noped the F out of there, leaving his friend to fend for himself as he ran as fast as he could to a nearby farmhouse. The second creature chased him for only about a minute or two, but then retreated back inside the craft. It literally levitated back into the craft it just floated down from. While all of this was going on, the being inside of the car with the still terrified will be gay, trapped inside of the car with it, starting to very rapidly spew some strange language at him. It turned to him and started doing this almost as though it were yelling at or lecturing him, but it was no discernible language he had ever heard, and he described it as, quote, sounding something like a bird, end quote. It then exited the car and joined its friend in floating back up into the UFO. It flew off, quote, in a zigzag path, end quote. These two reported this to the police and learned that they weren't the only ones to have witnessed something like this. Not only have there been numerous reports of the exact same type of UFO that they described and recently, but that random farmers were reporting that their livestock, cows in particular, were reportedly freaking out and taking off running in circles for seemingly no reason. There was nothing around that seemed to be the cause of their being spooked. And I wonder if there was cloaking going on here. Or maybe they were just in the woods and couldn't be seen by human eyes, but the animals sensed them. Not too long after, it all stopped, and there were never really any answers to what exactly was happening here or what these things were, what they wanted. There was none of that. It's like they just started coming, were dormant for 15 years, came back again, and then were gone again, and that's it. No explanation from the authorities. Obviously, the government didn't get involved, and the terrified and traumatized witnesses are just left to deal with this. That's it. Just deal with it, like, for the rest of their lives. 2 years later, it was a bright and beautiful day, and off-duty soldier Anthony Da Silva thought the weather was perfect to go and do some fishing. It was May 4th, 1969, and he was out at a lake near Belo Horizonte in Brazil when he had his horrible and confusing encounter with what seemed to be the same entities that we have been discussing all along here. As he sat there quietly, though, he became aware that he definitely wasn't alone out there. The area itself was very isolated, so that makes the fact that he felt someone or something else was there even more terrifying and threatening. As soon as he became aware there was definitely something moving / creeping up behind him, but before he could even turn around and see what was happening, he was hit with, quote, an intensely bright beam of light that paralyzed him, end quote. As this was happening, he couldn't move, but he could still see and was very much aware of what was happening around him. Two diminutive beings ran up to him. They grabbed him and dragged him into a large cylindrical craft. They forced a helmet on his head and he couldn't see anything anymore because the helmet doubles as a blindfold. The craft seemed to have flown off and stayed in the air for a bit, but then eventually it set back down and landed. The beings then took the helmet off and unceremoniously flung him back out, and because the helmet had been taken off, he could see again. He said he was now in some sort of stone cavern, which was brightly lit and decorated with large framed photos of random animals on Earth, like cows, chickens, things like that. To his absolute shock and horror, he noticed that there were 4 naked human beings lying in a prone position on a low shelf that was also made of stone. They weren't moving, and he couldn't tell if they were dead or alive. One of the small creatures stood in front of him, still with its helmet on, and he said he somehow instinctively knew that this was the leader of the group. I'll let him tell you the rest of it. He said, quote, he had a look on his face of apparent satisfaction. His long tresses, reddish and wavy, fell down behind past his shoulders to the waist. His beard was long and thick and came down to his stomach. His skin was light colored, very pale. His eyes were round, larger than is the norm with us, and of a green shade, end quote. I know some people are going to think or say that this was an actual dwarf, as far as in the sense of the fey creature, but I highly doubt it and still don't think there's enough evidentiary facts or actual research and data to show that extraterrestrials and fairies are connected in any way, shape, or form, but that's just my opinion. So, as far as Anthony is concerned, about 12 more of these little creatures came into the cavern and surrounded the poor guy, who was now more scared probably than any word in our vocabulary can describe. The beings grabbed at him and forcibly made him drink some sort of bitter-tasting, bright green liquid from a stone chalice in the shape of a pyramid. Then they robbed him. They legit took his wallet and even a few fish hooks he had in his pocket. Anthony went immediately to grab the rosary beads he was wearing as a necklace, but the leader of these thugs went ahead, snatched it off his neck, effectively breaking it and leaving the beads to fall all over the floor. The fact that Anthony grabbed the rosary seemed to have enraged the leader, and that's why he broke the rosary. Suddenly and seemingly out of nowhere, right after they robbed him and tore his rosary beads off of his neck, he said that, quote, a robed and barefoot, Christ-like figure, end quote, appeared in the room with them. But the craziest part of all of this was that the entity seemed to be completely oblivious that Jesus was now there with them. Only Anthony could see him. I'm just going to call this entity Jesus to save time in the description, but apparently he gave Anthony, quote, revelations for the future of humanity, end quote, and then he disappeared, leaving the victim to the devices of these miniature toughs. Yes, as always, I'm being facetious because I totally believe in every single thing I've presented to you all so far, and guys, I don't know, but it's just so wild to me. I am shocked as I read through the source materials I put together. Anyway, sorry, so Jesus leaves Anthony with these things, and the leader is seemingly still very pissed off about the rosary ordeal. Nothing at all that I could find says what Jesus allegedly told him either, so we never get to find out what the revelations were. Then, instead of forcing the helmet back on him to block his vision again, they instead blindfolded him and the ship took off again. When it finally stopped and they literally threw him out of the ship, he was 200 miles away from where they had taken him in the first place. Anthony thought that he had been gone for about an hour or so, but it would turn out, as he would later discover, he had actually been gone for 4 whole days. He absolutely refuses to tell anyone what the Jesus figure told him, and that's where this one ends. It just keeps getting stranger and stranger, I'm telling you. And there's more. In August of that same year, 1969, in Gateshead, England, there was a witness that came forward to tell her tale, and she decided to anonymously go by the name Carol W. Carol was just sitting in her house one night having some tea while waiting for her husband to come home from wherever he was. Suddenly, a bright red beam of light shot through her kitchen curtains, scaring the poop out of her. She got up to look out of the curtains and was shocked when she saw, very close to her home in the window she was staring out of, quote, a disc-shaped object sparkling with multicolored lights, end quote. It seemed like the second she looked at it, though, it shot back up into the sky and disappeared. Carol slowly backed away from the window and sat back down to resume drinking her tea. A miniature version of the same craft she had just seen hovering directly outside of her window now came into the window. She described it as being only about 18 inches in diameter and now hovering directly in front of her face. She explained that it had come directly through the glass window, quote, trailing a shower of glittering speckles behind it, end quote. It hovered before her for a second or two and then very quickly shot back up into the sky, where Carol thought it was rejoining the much larger ship she had just seen outside. Our witness stood there, stunned for a moment, but as we do as human beings, she tried to just forget about it and pretend like it hadn't happened. However, 2 weeks later, something happened that she could not ignore. Exactly 2 weeks later, she woke up in the middle of the night, completely paralyzed and unable to move. Sleep paralysis, right? When she opened her eyes, the same miniature UFO from the last time, or at least she thought it was the exact same one, was hovering directly above her face. Standing all around her bed, kind of surrounding her, were these tiny, diminutive, dwarf-like creatures. They were gathered there, right there, in her bedroom. They were all approximately 2 feet tall and wearing white suits. Carol explained that they had, quote, unreal-looking hair like dolls, end quote. That's what she notices, their hair. I'm not judging, it's just, it never ceases to amaze me the little details that people find so important when they're going through something so traumatic and experiencing something so incredibly unknown. The entire room almost vibrated with a strange buzzing sound, and the entities seemed to Carol like they were communicating with each other through a series of clicks. All of this was terrifying enough for our witness, but her dog was frantic and terrified and took to cowering in a corner somewhere. It's only explained that they, quote, examined her, end quote, but there's no detail at all about how they did this. Like, was it invasive, or was it just they were looking her up and down, or what? Carol said it was also weird because they, quote, somehow left, end quote, and there was no way, at least as far as we are aware of our own laws of physics, that they could have come from or entered the teeny tiny UFO that hovered there the entire time. These beings were diminutive, 2 feet tall, but they're not small enough to be able to enter a craft that's 18 inches wide. That doesn't compute with our reality. Most likely, more likely than not, I would say, they have some sort of science and technology that we can't comprehend or understand yet, because all of the beings and the UFO disappeared at exactly the same time. It's described in my source material as they all kind of just disappeared into the ether, and that was that. Carol said the same thing happened many times after this, until finally one night it just didn't happen anymore. There is no more information about this, and quite honestly, I don't know what to make of it. What do you guys think? This isn't the first time I have brought entities like this to you guys, whether in my videos titled High Strangeness or otherwise, and I just think it's so incredibly fascinating. Like, when all else fails, high strangeness. No matter how many encounters we come across with strange beings and creatures from another world, and no matter how many different entities we encounter, we are still no closer to knowing what we're dealing with. We have no idea still, after millennia. I think there are so many different things, and that they're not only coming from other places throughout the universe and galaxy, but that they're also quite possibly coming from other dimensions and places we can't even begin to wrap our human minds around yet. Maybe one day we'll have more answers, but I'm very doubtful it will be anytime soon, or that anyone alive today will be around to see it, because as we know, we, and I mean humans as a collective, we as a collective, can barely agree that UFOs and entities like this even exist. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed hanging out with me. Spread the love by sharing this video. Guys, gotta get the like to view ratio up a little bit. So please, if you know anyone that will like this content, share, subscribe if you haven't already. In the description box, you will find some important links, how to donate to the channel, PayPal, Cash App, and Patreon. If you become a patron for $20 a month or more, I will give you once a month, as a thank you from me, a personal intuitive oracle reading from me. You will also find links to Amazon for all 3 of my books, Kindle and paperback versions: Missing the Faith Theory, Encounters with Evil, 101 True and Terrifying Stories, and my newest book, Shadow Entities, Sleep Paralysis, and Beyond. If you would like a signed or autographed copy, or a personal intuitive oracle reading, or a one-on-one spirituality session with me, if you want to order something from my metaphysical shop, or know what any of that stuff is about, please email me at GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Again, if you want autographed copies of the books, please let me know. Hit me up. The link for my Amazon wish list gift link is also in the description box. You guys ask me a lot if you can send me something. If you do it through there, then I don't have to give out my address. There are things ranging from like the $5 range to like, I don't even know, decks, crystals, books, all types of stuff, guys. So jewelry, if you want to take a look at it, go right ahead. On Wednesday nights, right here on this channel from 7:30ish p.m. Eastern time to 11:30ish p.m. Eastern time, or whenever we run out of people to read for, join myself and Ghost Dragons for Personal Intuitive Oracle, where I pull one random card from one random deck and give you a weekly reading. I feel like I am tongue-tied right now. On Thursday nights, from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern time, it's myself, Ghost Dragons EW, and Miss Lara, Paranormal Pixie, and we discuss pretty much anything and everything. Things that are metaphysical, extraterrestrial. We kind of let the chat figure out where we're going to go with it. Wherever the chat goes, that's where we go in the stream. If you would like to be a guest on that show, you can do it through audio only or video, and you don't have to download anything. We'll just send you a link to StreamYard. You can come on any Thursday night as long as you let me know beforehand. Email me at GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. I'm sure I'm forgetting so many things. Guys, don't forget the spiritual helper boxes, the happiness boxes of love, as I like to call them, the personal intuitive oracle readings that you can purchase for me, the one-on-one video chats, the crystal kits, the metaphysical items that a lot of you probably have no idea that I even sell. So if you need information on that, like I said, hit me up. And for anything else, at GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. I feel like I just am completely tongue-tied and all twisted up. So be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. If nobody told you today, you're beautiful, you're amazing, you're capable. Abundance is your birthright as a human being, and I totally believe in you. You are awesome, okay? Always go in grace, smile at a stranger, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.